The morning of August 7th, 1943, over Vella Lavella in the Solomon Islands, Lieutenant Takeo Tanimizu pulled his Mitsubishi A6M0 into a climbing turn, scanning the sky through the optical gun sight mounted before his eyes. The air was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect hunting weather. Below, the green canopy of jungle stretched toward beaches where American forces had just landed. Tanimizu's mission was simple: intercept the enemy fighters protecting the invasion fleet, engage them in close combat, where the Zero's legendary maneuverability would decide the outcome, and drive them from the sky. He spotted them at 11,000 feet, a formation of 4 aircraft approaching from the southeast. They were large, brutish-looking machines, twin-boomed and ungainly compared to the elegant lines of his Zero, Republic P-38 Lightnings. Tanimizu had encountered them before. They were fast in a dive, difficult to catch when they chose to run, but clumsy in a turning fight. He pushed his throttle forward and began his approach, confident in the mathematics of aerial combat that had kept him alive through 18 months of war. The Zero could outturn anything the Americans flew, get inside their turning circle, bring the Type 99 20mm cannon to bear, fire a short burst, and move to the next target. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened in the next 90 seconds would fundamentally alter Tanimizu's understanding of aerial warfare. The lead P-38 pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Westbrook of the 39th Fighter Squadron, spotted the Zero climbing toward his formation. Rather than attempting to turn with the Japanese fighter, a contest he knew he would lose, Westbrook pushed his control column forward and dived, building speed, then pulled up sharply into a climbing attack that brought him head-on toward Tanimizu's aircraft. The closure rate exceeded 500 miles per hour. Tanimizu saw the P-38's nose light up with muzzle flashes, a continuous rippling fire that seemed impossibly intense. His Zero shuddered as something massive struck the engine cowling, then the left wing, then the canopy frame. Metal fragments filled the cockpit. The control stick went slack. The engine seized with a grinding shriek. Tanimizu's aircraft, which moments before had been a responsive extension of his will, became a falling coffin of torn aluminum and shattered systems. He managed to bail out at 4,000 feet, watching his Zero spiral into the jungle below. American PT boats picked him up 3 hours later, delirious from blood loss and shock. During his initial interrogation aboard USS Fletcher 2 days later, Tanimizu kept returning to one detail that seemed to have imprinted itself on his consciousness with traumatic clarity: the intensity of the gunfire, the weight of it. The way his aircraft had simply disintegrated under fire that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. He had been shot down before, had witnessed other aircraft destroyed in combat, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the concentrated violence of what he now understood the Americans called a head-on pass from a fighter carrying 8 50 caliber machine guns. The interrogation officer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Stassen, noted Tanimizu's repeated emphasis on American firepower. The Japanese pilot seemed unable to comprehend how an aircraft could mount such weaponry and still fly effectively. His Zero carried 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannon, weapons he had considered adequate, even superior in the case of the cannon. The idea that American fighters mounted 8 heavy machine guns, each firing projectiles nearly 3/4 of an inch in diameter at rates exceeding 800 rounds per minute, seemed to violate his understanding of aircraft design and combat doctrine. Tanimizu's experience was not unique. By August 1943, Japanese pilots throughout the Pacific were encountering American fighters whose firepower exceeded anything they had faced in the war's early campaigns. What followed was not a single moment of revelation, but a gradual, psychologically devastating process of understanding that would transform confident warriors into men who knew, with absolute certainty, that they were flying inferior machines against an enemy whose approach to aerial combat was fundamentally different from their own. To understand the psychological shock Japanese pilots experienced, one must first understand the doctrinal foundation upon which their confidence rested. The Imperial Japanese Navy's approach to fighter design emerged from specific strategic requirements and a particular philosophy of aerial combat that seemed validated by early war successes. The Mitsubishi A6M0, which entered service in 1940, represented the culmination of Japanese fighter doctrine. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi under requirements demanding unprecedented range, maneuverability, and climb rate, the Zero achieved its performance through radical weight reduction. The aircraft weighed just 3,704 pounds empty, achieved through eliminating armor protection for the pilot, omitting self-sealing fuel tanks, and using the lightest possible airframe construction, consistent with structural integrity. The armament reflected deliberate choices. Two Type 97 7.7mm machine guns, essentially license-built British Vickers guns, were mounted in the cowling, firing through the propeller arc. Two Type 99 20mm cannon, one in each wing, provided heavier firepower. Total ammunition capacity was 680 rounds for the machine guns and 100 rounds for each cannon. Japanese doctrine emphasized accuracy over volume of fire. Pilots trained extensively in deflection shooting, learning to place precise bursts rather than hosing targets with sustained fire. This approach worked spectacularly in the war's opening campaigns. Over China, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, Zero pilots achieved kill ratios that seemed to validate every design decision. The aircraft's maneuverability was genuinely revolutionary. At speeds below 250 miles per hour, nothing could turn with a Zero. Its roll rate, particularly to the left, was exceptional. Its climb rate exceeded any contemporary fighter. Japanese pilots exploited these advantages ruthlessly, forcing opponents into turning engagements where superior agility decided outcomes within seconds. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who would become Japan's third-ranking ace with 64 confirmed kills, later described the Zero's handling characteristics in terms approaching reverence. The aircraft responded instantly to control inputs. It could sustain turns at angles of attack that would stall other fighters. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could execute maneuvers that seemed to defy physics, hanging on its propeller, flicking into snap rolls, reversing direction with minimal altitude loss. The psychological dimension was equally important. Japanese naval aviators underwent training that was deliberately brutal, designed to produce pilots of exceptional skill but limited numbers. Training emphasized individual combat prowess, situational awareness, and the aggressive spirit captured in the concept of seishin, often translated inadequately as fighting spirit. Pilots were taught that superior skill and determination could overcome material disadvantages. The Zero's design validated this belief, providing a machine that rewarded pilot ability and punished hesitation. American fighters encountered in the early war seemed to confirm Japanese assumptions. The Brewster F-2, a Buffalo, Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, and early Grumman F-4F Wildcat all suffered severe disadvantages in turning combat with Zeros. American pilots who attempted traditional dogfighting tactics died quickly. Japanese pilots accumulated kills, gained confidence, and came to believe their approach to aerial warfare was superior. But American doctrine was evolving through a process Japanese strategists failed to recognize. The United States possessed industrial capacity to approach fighter design from an entirely different philosophical foundation. Rather than accepting weight constraints as absolute, American designers began building fighters around maximum firepower and pilot protection, accepting reduced maneuverability as an acceptable trade-off. The aircraft that emerged from this approach would carry weapons systems Japanese engineers had considered impossible to mount on single-engine fighters. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun, adopted by U.S. forces in 1921, fired a projectile measuring 12.7 mm in diameter, weighing approximately 1.6 ounces, at muzzle velocities exceeding 2,900 feet per second. A single gun fired at rates between 750 and 850 rounds per minute. The kinetic energy delivered by each projectile was roughly 5 times that of the 7.7mm rounds Japanese fighters carried. When 8 such weapons fired simultaneously, they delivered approximately 108 pounds of projectiles per minute toward the target, each round carrying enough energy to penetrate aluminum airframe structure, sever control cables, destroy engine components, and detonate fuel tanks. American fighter development in 1942 and 1943 proceeded along paths that seemed reckless by Japanese standards. Rather than pursuing the lightest possible airframe, American designers accepted substantial weight in exchange for firepower, protection, and structural strength. The result was a generation of fighters that challenged every assumption Japanese pilots held about what constituted an effective combat aircraft. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which entered combat in the European theatre in April 1943 and reached the Pacific later that year, epitomized this philosophy. The aircraft weighed 10,000 pounds empty, nearly 3 times the Zero's weight. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, the Thunderbolt could reach speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour in level flight and could dive at speeds approaching 550 miles per hour without structural failure. The armament was staggering by contemporary standards. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing, with 425 rounds per gun. Total ammunition load: 3,400 rounds weighing approximately 340 pounds. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, which occurred whenever the pilot pressed the trigger, the aircraft delivered 108 pounds of projectiles per minute, each round traveling at supersonic velocities, each capable of catastrophic damage to any aircraft structure it struck. The installation required careful engineering. Mounting 8 heavy machine guns in the wings demanded structural reinforcement to handle both the weight and the recoil forces. Each gun produced approximately 75 pounds of recoil force when firing. 8 guns firing together generated 600 pounds of recoil, enough to noticeably slow the aircraft and create vibration pilots could feel through the control column. Ammunition feeds required precise design to function reliably during high-G maneuvers. The guns were bore-sighted to converge at specific ranges, typically between 250 and 300 yards, creating a concentrated cone of fire where all 8 weapons' trajectories intersected. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, which Lieutenant Tanimizu encountered over Vella Lavella, carried similar firepower concentrated in the aircraft's nose. 1 Hispano 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns, all mounted on the centerline, firing without convergence issues that wing-mounted guns experienced. This installation offered advantages in long-range shooting, as the weapons remained aligned regardless of distance to target. Later variants, including the P-38L model that appeared in 1944, would test installations with up to 6 50 caliber guns plus the cannon. Pilots reported that the nose-mounted arrangement, while making the aircraft slightly nose-heavy, created a psychologically intimidating sight picture for enemy pilots who saw the P-38 approaching head-on. The entire nose would light up with muzzle flashes when the guns fired, creating an impression of overwhelming firepower that was, in fact, entirely accurate. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Zero and introduced to combat in August 1943, mounted 6 50 caliber guns with 400 rounds per gun. While carrying fewer weapons than the P-47, the Hellcat's installation was optimized for reliability and ease of maintenance. Navy armament officers could reload all 6 guns in approximately 12 minutes, compared to nearly 30 minutes for earlier installations. This seemingly mundane detail had profound implications for combat operations, as it meant Hellcat fighters could be turned around and launched on additional sorties, while Japanese mechanics were still patching battle damage and jury-rigging repairs to keep aircraft flying. American doctrine evolved to exploit this firepower advantage through tactics that minimized exposure to Japanese maneuverability. The boom and zoom approach, developed initially by Flying Tigers pilot Claire Chennault in China and refined by U.S. Navy and Army Air Force units throughout 1942 and 1943 emphasized altitude advantage, high-speed diving attacks, and immediate disengagement rather than sustained turning combat. American pilots were explicitly instructed never to attempt dogfighting with Zeros. Instead, they would dive from altitude, fire a burst during a high-speed pass, and climb away using their aircraft's superior power and speed, setting up for another attack if the target survived the first pass. The effectiveness of this approach depended entirely on firepower. A turning dogfight might last minutes, offering multiple shooting opportunities as aircraft maneuvered for position. A high-speed pass lasted seconds, offering perhaps a 2-second window when the target appeared in the gun sight. American fighters needed to inflict catastrophic damage during that brief opportunity. 8 50-caliber machine guns, firing 6,800 rounds per minute collectively, delivered that capability. A 2-second burst placed approximately 226 projectiles into the target area, each round carrying enough energy to destroy whatever it struck. The ballistic reality of 50-caliber firepower became apparent through cumulative evidence that Japanese pilots and intelligence officers could not ignore. Each encounter, each combat report, each recovered aircraft contributed to a growing understanding that American fighters operated under fundamentally different principles than Japanese doctrine anticipated. The Browning M2 50-caliber machine gun fired the 12.7mm BMG cartridge, a round originally developed for anti-tank use during World War I. The standard M2 ball ammunition used in aircraft installations featured a 709-grain full-metal jacket projectile, though armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds were intermixed in typical loading patterns. American armorers typically loaded belts with 4 ball rounds, 1 armor-piercing, 1 incendiary, and 1 tracer, repeating this pattern throughout the belt. The kinetic energy delivered by a single round at typical combat ranges exceeded 13,000 foot-pounds at the muzzle, degrading to approximately 9,000 foot-pounds at 300 yards. For comparison, the Japanese Type 97 7.7mm round delivered approximately 1,800 foot-pounds at the muzzle. The 50-caliber projectile carried roughly 5 times the energy, weighed 4 times as much, and maintained velocity more effectively across distance due to superior ballistic coefficient. When 8 guns fired simultaneously at a target 300 yards distant during a 2-second burst, approximately 226 rounds reached the target area, assuming all guns maintained reliable function. Of these rounds, roughly 32 were armor-piercing, 32 were incendiary, and 32 were tracers, with the remainder being standard ball ammunition. The total kinetic energy delivered exceeded 2 million foot-pounds, concentrated into an area roughly 10 feet in diameter at the convergence point. Japanese aircraft structures were not designed to withstand this level of punishment. The Zero's wing used a single spar design with aluminum skin ranging from 0.024 to 0.032 inches thick in most areas. 50-caliber rounds penetrated this structure effortlessly, often passing completely through the aircraft. More critically, the incendiary rounds ignited fuel vapors in the non-self-sealing tanks that occupied most of the wing's internal volume. Aircraft that survived the initial structural damage frequently burned catastrophically within seconds as incendiary rounds found fuel. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, recovering from wounds received in a combat encounter over Guadalcanal in August 1942, spent months analyzing combat reports from surviving pilots. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. Zeros that engaged American fighters in high-speed encounters rarely survived if they received direct hits. The aircraft simply came apart under 50-caliber fire. Wings separated from fuselage, tail sections detached, engine blocks shattered, fuel tanks exploded, control surfaces disintegrated. Sakai's own experience illustrated the vulnerability. During the Guadalcanal encounter, a single 50-caliber round had struck his canopy, fragmenting against the frame and driving glass and metal fragments into his skull, destroying his right eye and leaving him partially paralyzed. The round had not even directly struck him. yet the secondary fragmentation effects were nearly fatal. He had managed to fly his crippled Zero back to Rabaul, a distance of over 500 miles, only through extraordinary effort and mounting delirium from blood loss. The experience convinced him that American firepower had fundamentally altered the tactical equations he had relied upon for survival. Japanese intelligence officers attempted to quantify the disparity through analysis of recovered aircraft and pilot testimony. A report compiled at Rabaul in October 1943 examined 12 Zero fighters that had returned from combat with American P-38s and F-6F Hellcats. All 12 aircraft showed damage patterns consistent with 50 caliber hits. The report noted that single hits often caused disproportionate damage due to secondary effects, fuel fires, hydraulic failures, control cable severances, and structural failures propagating from initial impact points. The report's conclusion was stark. Japanese fighters could not sustain combat with American fighters under conditions where American pilots could bring their armament to bear effectively. The recommendation was to avoid head-on passes entirely, engage only when altitude and position advantages were overwhelming, and disengage immediately if American fighters achieved firing position. These were defensive tactics, fundamentally contrary to the aggressive doctrine that had characterized Japanese fighter operations since the war's beginning. Maintenance records provided additional evidence of the disparity. American fighters that returned from combat with battle damage were typically repaired and returned to service within days. Japanese fighters that sustained 50 caliber hits, even when flyable, often required weeks of repair work due to parts shortages, limited machine shop capacity, and the extensive nature of damage. A Zero that took a burst of 50 caliber fire through the wing might require complete replacement of the damaged section, a process requiring specialized jigs and skilled workers that were increasingly scarce at forward bases. Production statistics revealed the impossibility of matching American firepower through industrial means. Nakajima and Mitsubishi, the primary manufacturers of Japanese fighters, produced approximately 10,500 Zero fighters throughout the entire war. American factories produced over 12,000 P-47 Thunderbolts, over 9,900 P-38 Lightnings, and over 12,000 F-6F Hellcats, among numerous other fighter types. The United States was not merely producing more aircraft, it was producing aircraft that carried 4 to 8 times the armament of their Japanese counterparts, supported by ammunition production that exceeded Japanese output by similar margins. Browning M2 production in the United States exceeded 400,000 units during the war, with approximately 2 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition manufactured. Japan produced roughly 28,000 Type 99 20mm cannon and considerably fewer heavy machine guns. The industrial disparity meant that even if Japanese designers had recognized the importance of heavier armament earlier in the war, the manufacturing capacity to produce and supply such weapons did not exist. The psychological impact of American firepower manifested gradually through accumulated experience rather than single dramatic revelation. Japanese pilots throughout the Pacific Theater encountered American fighters with increasing frequency during late 1943 and throughout 1944, and each encounter reinforced the same lessons about firepower disparity. Flight Petty Officer Fujita Iyozo, flying from Rabaul in November 1943, recorded an encounter with P-38 Lightnings that illustrated the typical pattern. Fujita's section of 4 Zeros intercepted a formation of Lightnings escorting B-24 bombers over New Britain. The Japanese pilots achieved altitude advantage and initiated a diving attack, standard doctrine for engaging American fighters. The Lightnings did not attempt to turn with the Zeros. Instead, the American pilots dove away, building speed, then pulled up into climbing turns that brought them head-on to the pursuing Japanese fighters. Fujita described the encounter in his combat report as lasting perhaps 30 seconds of active engagement. The lead Lightning opened fire at a range Fujita estimated at 600 yards, far beyond the effective range of his own weapons. Tracer rounds arced past his canopy. He continued his approach, waiting to close to effective range for his cannon. At approximately 300 yards, the lightning's fire intensified dramatically. Fujita's wingman's Zero exploded, the left wing separating from the fuselage in a spray of burning fuel. Fujita broke hard right, abandoning his attack. The remaining 2 Zeros in his section did likewise. All 3 Japanese pilots survived by disengaging immediately and using their aircraft's superior turning radius to evade follow-up attacks. The pattern repeated across hundreds of similar encounters. Japanese pilots achieved initial position advantages through superior maneuverability, then found themselves unable to press attacks against American fighters, whose pilots refused to engage in turning combat, and whose firepower destroyed Japanese aircraft during brief firing opportunities in head-on or high-deflection passes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Kano Naoshi, one of Japan's leading aces with 25 confirmed victories, provided detailed analysis of American fighter tactics during interrogations after the war. Kano emphasized that American pilots exploited their firepower advantage through tactics that maximized their strengths while avoiding Japanese strengths. The Thach weave, developed by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander John Thach and widely adopted throughout American fighter units, exemplified this approach. The Thach weave involved 2 plane sections flying parallel courses, separated by approximately 1,500 feet. When Japanese fighters attacked one aircraft, it would turn toward its wingman. The wingman, seeing the attacking Japanese fighters cross his nose, would have a brief opportunity to fire a deflection shot as the enemy aircraft pursued his partner. The geometry meant Japanese pilots committed to pursuit found themselves repeatedly crossing in front of American fighters whose .850 caliber guns required only a brief firing opportunity to inflict catastrophic damage. Kano described the psychological effect of repeatedly engaging American formations that refused to fight on Japanese terms. Skilled Japanese pilots found their superior maneuvering ability irrelevant when American pilots would not attempt turning combat. Attempting to force engagement by pursuing American fighters resulted in the pursuer becoming exposed to fire from other American aircraft in the formation. The mathematics favored American tactics. A 2-second burst from .850 caliber guns could destroy a Zero, while Japanese pilots needed sustained firing opportunities their opponents refused to provide. By mid-1944, Japanese fighter units were experiencing loss rates that exceeded replacement capacity. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost approximately 1,500 fighter pilots killed or missing during 1944 against production of roughly 1,200 new pilots from training programs. The deficit was compounded by the declining experience level of replacement pilots, as intensive American combat operations left insufficient time for the extensive training Japanese doctrine required. Newly assigned pilots arriving at frontline units in 1944 had typically received 100 to 150 hours of flight training, compared to 500 to 700 hours for pilots who entered service in 1941 and 1942. These inexperienced pilots faced American aviators who possessed not only superior aircraft and firepower, but also increasing tactical sophistication gained through continuous combat operations. The testimony of these replacement pilots provides perhaps the clearest evidence of how American firepower affected Japanese morale. Ensign Sakamoto Hiroyoshi, assigned to the 201st Naval Air Group in June 1944 with 127 hours total flight time, survived only 3 combat missions before being shot down and rescued by Japanese coastal craft near Saipan. During his interrogation after the war, Sakamoto stated that he understood he would likely die within weeks of reaching his operational unit. The veterans who provided hasty combat orientation before his first mission emphasized one principle above all others: never allow American fighters to achieve firing position because a single burst would kill you. Sakamoto described his final combat mission in detail that reveals the psychological reality Japanese pilots faced. His section of 6 Zeros intercepted F-6F Hellcats attacking Japanese positions on Saipan. The Hellcats were flying in loose formations at medium altitude. Sakamoto's section leader attempted a diving attack, aiming to exploit the Zero's superior acceleration in the dive to achieve one firing pass before disengaging. The Hellcats detected the attack, possibly through radar-equipped fighter director controllers aboard American ships offshore, and 4 Hellcats turned into the Japanese attack while the remainder continued their ground attack mission. The engagement lasted less than a minute. The Hellcats did not attempt to turn with the Zeros, but instead used their superior speed and power to execute vertical maneuvers, climbing attacks, and high-speed disengaging runs that prevented Japanese pilots from achieving stable firing positions. When the Hellcats did fire, the effect was decisive. Sakamoto watched 3 Zeros from his section destroyed in rapid succession, each aircraft disintegrating under fire that seemed impossibly concentrated. His section leader's Zero lost its entire left wing to a burst that lasted perhaps 1 second. The aircraft spun violently and crashed into the ocean before the pilot could bail out. Sakamoto escaped by diving to wave-top altitude and flying directly away from the engagement at full throttle. His Zero could not outrun the Hellcats in level flight, but the American pilots chose not to pursue him individually, instead reforming and continuing their assigned mission. Sakamoto returned to base with his aircraft undamaged, but his confidence shattered. He told interrogators that he understood in that moment that Japanese pilots were being systematically slaughtered by an enemy whose material advantages rendered individual skill increasingly irrelevant. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought June 19 through 20, 1944, provided the most concentrated demonstration of American firepower superiority, and marked the point at which even senior Japanese commanders could no longer deny the hopelessness of their situation. American pilots would later call this engagement the Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that reflected both the one-sided nature of the combat and the professional confidence American aviators had developed through 18 months of increasing technological and tactical dominance. The Japanese mobile fleet, under Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, had assembled approximately 430 carrier aircraft for what was intended as a decisive engagement with American forces supporting the invasion of Saipan. The Japanese plan relied on land-based aircraft operating from Guam and other Marianas Islands to supplement carrier air groups, creating a numerical advantage that might offset American material superiority. The plan failed completely. American forces, centered on Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, possessed 15 fleet carriers and nearly 900 aircraft. More importantly, American fighters were overwhelmingly F-6F Hellcats, each carrying 650 caliber machine guns and flown by pilots with extensive combat experience and thorough tactical training. The Hellcat had been designed specifically to counter the Zero, matching its maneuverability at combat speeds while offering vastly superior firepower, protection, and high-speed performance. The battle began the morning of June 19th, when Japanese scout aircraft detected the American fleet. Ozawa launched his first strike wave of 69 aircraft, primarily Zeros and Judy dive bombers, at 8:30 a.m. American radar detected the incoming raid at a distance of 150 miles. Mitcher launched every available fighter, over 220 Hellcats, to intercept the Japanese strike well away from the fleet. The resulting combat was catastrophic for Japanese forces. American fighters, vectored to intercept positions by fighter director officers aboard ships using radar information, met the Japanese formations at altitudes and positions that gave U.S. pilots every advantage. The engagement devolved into running slaughter as Hellcat pilots systematically destroyed Japanese aircraft that lacked the speed to escape, the maneuverability to compete at combat speeds, and the firepower to fight effectively even when they achieved rare shooting opportunities. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 15 flying from USS Essex, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft during the day's combat. His combat report, filed that evening, described engagements that rarely lasted more than 1 or 2 passes. Brewer's typical attack involved a high-speed diving pass from altitude, a 2-second burst from his 650 caliber guns, and immediate disengagement. Of the 6 aircraft he destroyed, 4 exploded immediately when hit, 1 broke apart structurally, and one caught fire and crashed within seconds. None survived long enough for the pilot to bail out. None returned fire effectively. The pattern repeated throughout Task Force 58's fighter groups. American pilots reported that Japanese aircraft seemed to disintegrate under .50 caliber fire, burning almost instantly when hit due to the unprotected fuel tanks that had been sacrificed for range and maneuverability. Veteran American pilots noted that Japanese formations seemed less skilled than earlier in the war, with pilots flying predictable patterns and showing little awareness of American fighters until fired upon. This observation was accurate. Many Japanese pilots participating in the Philippine Sea Battle had less than 6 months of operational experience and minimal combat training. They were flying against American pilots who had been in continuous combat operations for a year or more, who flew aircraft specifically designed to exploit Japanese weaknesses and who possessed firepower advantages that made brief shooting opportunities lethal. By day's end, Japanese forces had launched 4 major strike waves, totaling 373 aircraft against Task Force 58. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed approximately 330 Japanese aircraft. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, most to operational accidents rather than combat. The Japanese mobile fleet's air groups had been effectively destroyed. Carriers returned to Japan with skeleton crews of aircraft and pilots, so shaken by the day's losses that many were deemed unfit for further combat operations. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, one of the few experienced Japanese pilots who survived the battle, provided testimony during post-war interrogations that revealed the psychological impact of the engagement. Abe had entered the war as a veteran with combat experience over China and had survived the early Pacific campaigns. He described the Philippine Sea Battle as the moment he understood Japan had already lost the war, regardless of what propaganda claimed or what orders came from commanders who refused to accept reality. Abe's testimony emphasized the firepower disparity. He described watching Zeros he had flown alongside being destroyed so quickly that pilots had no chance to react, let alone evade or return fire. He described the helpless feeling of being pursued by American fighters, whose superior speed made escape impossible and whose armament destroyed any aircraft that received hits. He described returning to his carrier with fewer than 20 aircraft from a strike wave that had launched with over 90, finding the deck crowded with crashed aircraft, wounded pilots, and maintenance crews who could not repair the catastrophic damage .50 caliber guns had inflicted on aircraft that managed to return. Most significantly, Abe described the psychological state of surviving pilots after the battle. There was no discussion of revenge or renewed effort. There was only exhausted recognition that continued combat against American forces meant certain death. Pilots who had been confident warriors weeks before were now men waiting to die, understanding that their aircraft were obsolete, their tactics countered, and their chances of survival negligible against an enemy whose material advantages were overwhelming and unchallengeable. The psychological transformation of Japanese fighter pilots after encounters with American firepower manifested in ways that extended far beyond simple fear of death. Combat aviators are necessarily men who have made peace with mortality, who accept death as an occupational hazard. What American firepower inflicted was something more insidious, the certain knowledge that skill, courage, and determination were irrelevant against material superiority of such overwhelming magnitude. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, recovering from his wounds at Yokosuka Naval Hospital in late 1943, spent months interviewing pilots rotating back from frontline units. The conversations revealed a pattern of psychological deterioration that alarmed him sufficiently to compose a detailed report for Naval Aviation Command. The report, which survived the war in captured Japanese naval archives, described what Sakai termed the collapse of fighting spirit through material despair. Sakai noted that pilots returning from the Solomons, Rabaul, and New Guinea forward bases universally reported the same experience. Japanese fighters could no longer engage American aircraft on equal terms. The firepower disparity meant that any exchange of fire favored American pilots overwhelmingly. Japanese pilots who achieved shooting positions found their weapons inadequate to reliably destroy American fighters, which were protected by armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust structure. American pilots who achieved shooting positions destroyed Japanese fighters almost instantly. The mathematical reality was stark. A zero hitting an F-6F Hellcat required sustained fire to inflict critical damage. Multiple 20mm cannon rounds might be necessary to destroy critical systems through the Hellcat's armor protection. A Hellcat hitting a zero required only a brief burst to ignite unprotected fuel tanks, sever control cables, or destroy the engine. The asymmetry meant Japanese pilots needed multiple shooting opportunities to achieve kills, while American pilots needed only one. This disparity had profound effects on combat effectiveness beyond simple loss rates. Japanese pilots became increasingly cautious, avoiding engagement unless circumstances were overwhelmingly favorable. The aggressive doctrine that had characterized Japanese fighter operations in 1941 and 1942 gave way to defensive tactics focused on survival rather than victory. Pilots who might have pressed attacks in earlier periods now broke off at the first sign of American resistance, understanding that sustained combat meant certain death. Warrant Officer Fujita Iozo, who had survived his November 1943 encounter with P-38 Lightnings, kept a personal diary that provides rare insight into the psychological state of Japanese pilots during this period. Entries from December 1943 through March 1944, recovered after his death in combat in April 1944, document his deteriorating morale and that of his squadron mates. Fujita wrote extensively about the firepower disparity. He described watching American fighters destroy Zeros with single bursts, while Japanese pilots expended all their ammunition, attempting to damage American aircraft that simply absorbed hits and continued fighting. He described the frustration of achieving perfect shooting positions only to watch his cannon shells strike American fighters without visible effect, while return fire from 50 caliber guns destroyed his wingmen's aircraft in seconds. More significantly, Fujita described the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources. American aircraft appeared in increasing numbers throughout late 1943 and early 1944. Every aircraft Japanese pilots destroyed was replaced within days. Japanese losses were permanent. Squadrons that lost pilots in combat received replacements with minimal training who died on their first or second missions. Aircraft destroyed in combat might not be replaced for weeks or months. Ammunition expenditures were carefully monitored due to supply constraints. By March 1944, Fujita was writing entries that revealed complete demoralization. He understood he would die soon. He understood his death would accomplish nothing. He understood the war was lost regardless of what propaganda claimed or what orders commanders issued. His final entry, dated April 7, 1944, 2 days before his death in combat near Hollandia, stated simply that he hoped his death would be quick, that he would not burn or drown, that someone would remember he had tried his best with inadequate tools against an enemy whose material advantages were insurmountable. Japanese aviation commanders recognized the morale crisis, but possessed no solutions. The industrial capacity to produce aircraft matching American firepower did not exist. Attempts to upgun existing fighters founded on weight and performance penalties. The Nakajima Ki-84, Hayate, designed as a Japanese equivalent to American fighters with heavier armament, entered service too late and in insufficient numbers to affect the war's outcome. Only 3,500 were produced before war's end, compared to over 12,000 Hellcats alone. Training programs attempted to adapt tactics to offset American firepower advantages, but the mathematics were unforgiving. Japanese doctrine increasingly emphasized avoiding combat entirely, focusing fighter assets on intercepting bombers rather than engaging American fighters. This defensive posture reflected recognition that Japanese fighters could no longer control airspace against American opposition. The casualty statistics documented the cost. Japanese naval aviation lost approximately 2,500 pilots killed in combat during 1944, against production of roughly 1,200 replacement pilots. The deficit was covered by lowering training standards and rushing pilots to operational units with minimal preparation. These inexperienced pilots died even more quickly than the veterans they replaced, creating a death spiral of declining effectiveness and increasing losses. By late 1944, Japanese fighter units were shadows of their former capabilities. Squadrons operated at partial strength due to aircraft and pilot shortages. Maintenance standards deteriorated as spare parts became scarce and skilled mechanics were killed or transferred. Operational readiness rates fell below 50% in many units. Pilots who survived to fly combat missions faced American formations that outnumbered them 3 or 4 to 1, composed of aircraft carrying firepower that made every encounter potentially lethal. The psychological burden was compounded by knowledge that their sacrifices were futile. American forces continued advancing regardless of Japanese resistance. The industrial disparity that manifested in firepower superiority extended to every aspect of the war. Japanese pilots were dying in obsolete aircraft to defend positions that would inevitably fall, to protect ships that would inevitably be sunk, to support armies that would inevitably be defeated. The certainty of ultimate failure drained meaning from individual sacrifice. Senior commanders attempted to maintain morale through traditional appeals to honor, duty, and sacrifice for the emperor. These appeals increasingly rang hollow to pilots who understood the material reality of their situation. Lieutenant Commander Kano Naoshi, one of the few experienced pilots who survived the war, later told American interrogators that by late 1944, pilots discussed openly among themselves that the war was lost, that continued fighting was pointless, that their deaths would accomplish nothing beyond delaying inevitable defeat. Yet they continued flying, continued fighting, continued dying, because the alternative was unthinkable within the cultural context that defined their identity as naval officers and Japanese subjects. The psychological burden of this contradiction, fighting with absolute certainty of futility, contributed to the ultimate embrace of kamikaze tactics that characterized the war's final year. The adoption of organized kamikaze attacks in October 1944 represented the final, terrible admission that Japanese aviation could no longer compete with American forces through conventional means. The decision to deliberately crash explosive-laden aircraft into American ships was not born from fanaticism or cultural peculiarity, as post-war American propaganda often suggested. It emerged from cold calculation about the impossibility of achieving combat effectiveness against enemies whose firepower advantages had rendered traditional attack methods suicidal without achieving proportional results. Vice Admiral Onishi Takejiro, who organized the first official kamikaze units in the Philippines in October 1944, understood this mathematics explicitly. Conventional torpedo and dive bombing attacks against American ships required pilots to penetrate intense anti-aircraft fire, deliver weapons with precision, and escape to fight another day. American defensive firepower, including proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells and concentrated 50 caliber and 40 mm gun batteries, made this approach increasingly fatal. Strike groups launched against American task forces in late 1944 often suffered 70 to 80% casualties while achieving minimal hits. Onishi's calculation was brutal but logical. If pilots were going to die anyway, better to ensure their deaths achieved damage by deliberately crashing into targets. A kamikaze attack required less skill than conventional bombing, allowing the use of minimally trained pilots who possessed neither the experience nor the aircraft to fight effectively against American interceptors. The aircraft itself became the weapon, with the pilot serving as guidance system for what was essentially a manned cruise missile. The firepower gap that had destroyed Japanese conventional fighter effectiveness manifested differently in kamikaze operations but remained decisive. American combat air patrols, flying Hellcats and later F-4U Corsairs, could destroy kamikaze aircraft at ranges exceeding a mile using their 50 caliber armament. The Japanese aircraft, typically older models or hastily constructed trainers pressed into combat service, possessed neither the speed to escape interception nor the structural strength to survive hits from American guns. Lieutenant Yasunori Aoki, assigned to the 6th Yamato Special Attack Unit in January 1945, left a diary that provides insight into kamikaze pilots' understanding of their situation. Aoki had completed flight training in August 1944, with 145 hours total flying time. He possessed no combat experience and had received minimal training in the obsolete Ki-43 Oscar fighter he would fly on his final mission. His diary entries describe his acceptance of death not as glorious sacrifice, but as inevitable outcome of material inferiority. Aoki wrote extensively about the firepower disparity. He described conversations with pilots who had survived conventional combat missions and had witnessed entire formations destroyed by American fighters before reaching their targets. He noted that kamikaze tactics at least ensured that pilot deaths might achieve some damage, whereas conventional attacks simply resulted in Japanese pilots being shot down short of their targets without accomplishing anything. The logic was grim but reflected accurate assessment of tactical reality. The effectiveness of kamikaze attacks, measured by percentage of aircraft that successfully hit targets, remained low due to American defensive firepower. Of approximately 2,800 kamikaze sorties launched between October 1944 and August 1945, fewer than 400 achieved hits on American ships. The vast majority were destroyed by American fighters or anti-aircraft fire before reaching targets. American fighter pilots, using their firepower advantages, could destroy multiple kamikaze aircraft during single combat air patrol missions. Commander David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's leading ace, with 34 confirmed victories, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission on October 24, 1944, many of them aircraft attempting kamikaze attacks during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. McCampbell's success exemplified how American firepower advantages persisted even against opponents who had abandoned survival as a goal. His F-6F Hellcats 650 caliber guns allowed him to destroy targets quickly and move to the next, engaging multiple aircraft during the time Japanese pilots would have needed to line up single shots with their lighter armament. The psychological cost of kamikaze operations extended beyond the pilots who flew them. Maintenance crews, commanders, and support personnel understood they were participating in organized suicide missions driven by material desperation. The operations corroded morale throughout Japanese naval aviation, creating an atmosphere of fatalistic resignation that affected even personnel not directly involved in kamikaze units. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, who had survived the Philippine Sea battle, was assigned to Kamikaze Unit Command in March 1945. He later described the experience as psychologically devastating, watching young pilots depart on missions from which they would not return, knowing their deaths would accomplish little, understanding that the entire effort represented admission that Japanese aviation could not compete against American material superiority through any conventional means. The kamikaze campaign ultimately failed to halt American advance or inflict strategically significant damage on U.S. forces. American shipyards replaced losses faster than kamikaze attacks could inflict them. American damage control procedures minimized the impact of successful hits. American firepower destroyed the majority of attacking aircraft before they reached targets. The campaign consumed approximately 5,000 aircraft and pilots while sinking fewer than 50 American ships, most of them smaller vessels. The exchange ratio represented devastating defeat dressed in rhetoric of glorious sacrifice. The end of the war in August 1945 brought Japanese aviation personnel face to face with the full extent of American technological and industrial superiority they had fought against. As Allied occupation forces moved into Japan, former Japanese pilots encountered American aircraft, weapons, and equipment that confirmed everything they had concluded during years of progressively one-sided combat. Technical intelligence teams from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive interviews with surviving Japanese aviation officers during late 1945 and early 1946. These interrogations, preserved in detailed reports, provide the clearest picture of how Japanese airmen understood their defeat, and specifically how American firepower had contributed to it. Lieutenant Commander Kano Naoshi, interrogated at length about Japanese fighter tactics and doctrine, provided analysis that American intelligence officers found remarkably objective and technically sophisticated. Kano stated explicitly that Japanese aviation had lost the Pacific War, primarily due to industrial and technological inferiority that manifested most obviously in firepower disparity. He noted that Japanese pilots had recognized this reality by mid-1944, but that senior commanders had refused to acknowledge what field units understood implicitly. Kano emphasized that American .50 caliber armament had rendered Japanese fighters obsolete, not merely through superior destructive power, but through the tactical flexibility it provided. American pilots could engage Japanese aircraft at ranges and in situations where Japanese weapons were ineffective. American fighters could destroy targets with brief firing opportunities that Japanese pilots needed sustained fire to exploit. The cumulative effect was tactical dominance that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. When American intelligence officers allowed Japanese aviation personnel to examine captured American aircraft in detail, the responses confirmed what combat experience had taught. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who participated in these examinations, later wrote that seeing 850 caliber machine guns mounted in a P-47 Thunderbolts wings clarified why his Zero had seemed so inadequate. The weight of the American aircraft's armament alone exceeded the total weight of ammunition his Zero had carried. The industrial capacity required to produce such aircraft in quantities exceeding 10,000 exemplified the disparity between American and Japanese war economies. Japanese aviation personnel toured American facilities in occupied Japan and witnessed industrial capabilities that explained the material superiority they had faced. Former pilots saw American factories producing spare parts in quantities that exceeded total Japanese production of complete aircraft. They saw ammunition dumps containing more .50 caliber rounds than Japanese factories had manufactured during the entire war. They saw maintenance operations that could overhaul and return aircraft to service in timeframes. Japanese units could not approach even with undamaged aircraft. The psychological impact extended beyond simple recognition of defeat. Japanese aviation officers understood that their pre-war assumptions about warfare had been fundamentally wrong. They had believed that superior training, aggressive spirit, and pilot skill could overcome material disadvantages. American firepower had demonstrated that industrial capacity and technological superiority trumped individual ability when the gap was sufficiently large. This recognition influenced post-war Japanese military and industrial development profoundly. The Japanese self-defense forces, established in the 1950s, abandoned pre-war doctrines emphasizing spiritual factors over material capabilities. New training emphasized realistic assessment of enemy capabilities and honest evaluation of friendly limitations. The romantic notions that had characterized pre-war Japanese military culture were replaced with pragmatic focus on technological competence and industrial capacity. Japanese industry, rebuilt with American assistance during occupation, incorporated lessons about the importance of manufacturing capacity, standardization, and quality control that American industry had demonstrated during the war. Companies like Mitsubishi, which had built the Zero, transitioned to producing civilian goods using manufacturing processes that emphasized the industrial efficiency that had made American war production overwhelming. Former naval aviation officers took positions throughout post-war Japanese industry and government, carrying with them lessons learned through defeat. The emphasis on technological excellence, manufacturing quality, and industrial efficiency that characterized Japan's post-war economic miracle reflected understanding that material capability determined outcomes in modern competition, whether military or economic. The firepower disparity that had destroyed Japanese aviation supremacy became case study in Japanese military education and industrial planning. The lesson was clear: technological gaps of sufficient magnitude cannot be overcome through determination or skill. Nations that fall behind in industrial capacity and technological development cannot compete against opponents who possess overwhelming material advantages. By the 1980s, Japan had developed indigenous fighters like the Mitsubishi F-2 that incorporated lessons learned from wartime defeat. These aircraft carried sophisticated avionics, advanced weapons systems, and were designed with full understanding that firepower, protection, and technological sophistication mattered more than traditional measures of fighter performance like maneuverability or range. The circle was complete. The nation whose pilots had been destroyed by overwhelming American firepower had learned to build fighters embodying the principles that had defeated them. The story of Japanese pilots encountering American .50 caliber firepower is ultimately about the collision between romantic military doctrine and industrial reality. Japanese aviation entered World War II with superb pilots flying elegant aircraft designed around assumptions about combat that proved fatally flawed when confronted with opponents who approached warfare as industrial problem rather than test of martial spirit. The 8.50 caliber machine guns American fighters carried represented not just weapons, but philosophy of warfare, emphasizing material superiority over individual prowess. Each gun embodied industrial capacity that Japanese economy could not match. Each round fired represented manufacturing capability that exceeded Japanese production. The cumulative effect was dominance so complete that Japanese pilots, regardless of skill or courage, fought from positions of permanent disadvantage. Commander Uno Kamio, whose submarine I-52 was destroyed by acoustic torpedoes, died not understanding what technology had killed him. Japanese fighter pilots understood exactly what was killing them. They saw the muzzle flashes of 8.50 caliber guns. They watched their aircraft disintegrate under fire they could not avoid or survive. They understood with terrible clarity that they were fighting enemies whose material advantages were insurmountable. That understanding, gained through years of progressively one-sided combat, shaped post-war Japan more profoundly than any occupation policy or reconstruction program. The men who survived carried knowledge that determined national priorities for generations. Technological capability and industrial capacity matter more than traditional military virtues. Nations that fall behind in material development lose wars regardless of courage, skill, or determination their forces possess. The ocean never belonged to Japan. The sky never belonged to Japan. Both were always the domain of whoever controlled the industrial and technological means to dominate them. American .50 caliber firepower taught that lesson to Japanese pilots through experience measured in thousands of deaths and shattered aircraft falling from skies they had once commanded with confidence. The lesson endured long after the guns fell silent, and the survivors returned home to rebuild their nation on foundations, informed by hard truths, learned through overwhelming defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.